I'm going to do a little bit of a tour of the world, provide a little bit of analysis on developments in e-invoicing, but also try to share with you some analysis, some ideas as to why things are the way they are in terms of regulatory constraints. I think that's actually a much more interesting thing to do than just looking at what the rules are. Just look at the rules. It's not always obvious what it is as a company that you should do. Whereas if you look behind the screens and you're trying to understand where tax administrations come from in creating the rules, then it becomes, I think, easier to put together a strategy that actually works, that you can rely on also in the long term. So to start off with, I will show you another slide. I'll do a bit of I'll step aside a little bit and not talk about e-invoicing right away, but talk about VAT. Obviously, you guys are all very well aware of how VAT works. It's, for most of you, probably your full-time day job. But interestingly, when we engage even with VAT managers who've been doing this for the last 20 years, and we ask them, do you really fully understand how VAT, how important it is for countries and what it actually means in macroeconomic terms? The answer is often not that obvious to them. So here's the question I often ask, particularly with people who don't have a background in VAT. I can't help mentioning we work with a lot of American companies. I know there's a bunch of American companies around here. You know what it is if you're responsible for VAT. You have to explain VAT to somebody in the US, who has a decent background in business and law and accounting, but just hasn't been confronted with VAT as a tax type yet. It's not easy, right? So we have these slides that we use to sort of give people a little bit of background. And we ask the question, do you know what provides 30 to 50% of all public revenue, that pays to 30 to 50% of all schools, armies, highways, hospitals, you name it? And the answer is VAT. 30 to 50%, and in some countries it's more than 50%. More than 50% of all public revenue in some countries comes from VAT. That's a humongous number, of course. And then, of course, these sort of go to the story of VAT being a self-assessment tax, or it's a very nice term for basically saying it's a smart way for governments to turn companies into tax collectors, essentially. Right? A very low-cost way for governments to basically make a lot of money, collect a lot of money on the basis of your procedures. Right? That's basically how VAT works. What does that have to do with invoicing? Well, it's a self-assessment tax. It means businesses actually do the work of tax administrations, but there comes a point where tax administrations obviously want to verify that you did their job correctly. And that's the famous moment of audit that we're all painfully aware of, where the invoice, whether we like it or not, formally is the only regulated business document, the only piece of formal evidence that every single VAT law in the world requires you to have, with a certain content, and in certain cases also in a certain form. Right? So if you put those two things together, 30 to 50% of all public revenue, the invoice being the only regulated piece of evidence for showing to tax administrations that you've done their job correctly, then you start to understand the importance of the invoice over and above just it being an important piece of business documentation. It's a critical piece of evidence in the enforcement of public law. And not just any public law that relates to huge amounts of money for many countries. It gets worse, though, because even though a lot of people, a lot of economists think VAT is a very efficient tax, they skip over the fact that there's this thing called a VAT gap, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, which essentially means that governments don't actually collect all the VAT that they want to collect. And the difference between what they think they should collect and what they actually collect in practice is just absolutely staggering. In Europe, the average VAT gap is 20%. So 20% of the money that should be collected by you acting as, instead of the tax administration, is not collected. Going to places like Latin America, but there is another favorite example we've heard in the last couple of days, Turkey, Russia, and other places. The VAT gap can be up to 30%, and in other cases, actually even higher. So there are countries where a third of this very important tax is actually not being collected as a result of malpractice mostly, but also fraud. That, of course, if you put this in the context of today's global economy, these numbers are very significant. This is so much money. And we have known from the last two financial crises that, of course, the ability for countries to actually collect tax is incredibly important. Right? So put these things together, it sort of gives you a different perspective of why there are rules around invoicing in the first place. I mean, the invoice is a fairly critical piece in this entire puzzle, and this entire puzzle is about hundreds and hundreds of billions of euros. So obviously, governments want to control invoicing. They don't only want to control invoicing, as you know. There's plenty of other things they would like to control. But the invoice and invoice controls are, at least in the law, very prominent, and they're very important in practice as well. And when companies started to exchange data, business data, electronically with their trading partners a couple of decades ago, tax administrations, of course, got nervous about that because they weren't used to dealing with invoices in electronic format. And that was the beginning of countries starting to think about, hey, now that there is this internet thing and this EDI thing, how are we actually going to deal with the fact that sooner or later they're not going to be invoices in paper format anymore? So all of our audit practices that we've built up over the last many decades to have a system that works reasonably well. So again, reasonably well being 20 to 30% VAT gap, but it's sort of imbalanced from the perspective of most tax administrations, was in danger because how do you audit bits and bytes? So if we look at the world within our company, Trustweaver, we have a lot of people who do legal monitoring for us on a daily basis in about 80 countries. So we have a pretty good understanding of what happens, how legislation evolves around e-invoicing worldwide. What we see is the emergence of two, I would say, competing control systems. The first one is, obviously, most of you are familiar with, started in Europe, whereby basically the European Commission said, under certain conditions, all of the member states of the European Union must accept electronic invoices for VAT purposes. Right? But the concept behind that was to say, e-invoicing really isn't that different from paper invoicing. A supplier creates an invoice, the buyer receives it, validates it, both parties store it, and we'll come around and audit it in the next decade or so, which is what we call the ex-post control mechanism. We'll come around later and check it. Exactly the same thing as has been happening in the paper world for a very long time. Right, so that's focused on the back end of the invoicing process. Starting in Chile then, in 2001, and spreading very rapidly around the world now, is this control mechanism that completely changes the way of looking at electronic invoicing. It's this clearance method. It's focused on not on what happens when an invoice is already being processed, and many years later we'll look at it. It looks at the moment of processing of an invoice. Typically looks at the invoice before it's actually even issued. You're probably all aware of countries like Brazil and other places where you actually have to send the invoice to the tax administration before you can even issue it to your trading partner. This clearance mechanism, that basically puts the control point inside the process, has been so effective for governments that had real issues with black market and with understanding their own economy, that a lot of the emerging BRICS and other countries have adopted that system in the last just couple of years. And now there are, I would say, competing systems in a very interesting way, because these orange clearance countries here, again, they've been so effective that towards the south and the east of Europe, the European Union, we can see already that people are looking and going, whoa, that's actually a very interesting way of doing it. The first country to have implemented already today a similar system is Portugal, within the European Union. Greece is talking about doing the same thing. It's pretty obvious that other countries that are really struggling with tax collection, with VAT collection, are probably going to go down the same path. There's another third approach, which is a small, I would say, experimental approach in some countries, like the Netherlands, actually, in Australia and a few others, where they put the control point way up front and actually try to have almost a contract-based approach with larger companies to say, let's document how you will maintain your processes, let's document your change management together between the tax administration and the company. And then, if you will sign off on this as your processes, then we will hold back in our audit procedures. But this doesn't happen very much, and you really do need a very progressive tax administration as the one that they have in this country in order to even attempt it. Okay, so unfortunately, this sort of dichotomy of two neatly defined systems that somewhat compete with each other in the world isn't the end of the story, right? I mean, between these two systems, within these systems, there's a lot of diversity yet. So we do a lot of research, of course, on a much more granular level as well. This is just an overview showing you more or less how many different areas are regulated around electronic invoicing in a number of regions in the world, and we've picked out a few countries as well. just to show you how countries like Brazil, Russia, and Turkey, how much they regulate compared to the average in some of the regions. It's a lot of regulation. So the trend worldwide, particularly in emerging economies, is towards very prescriptive regulation. E-invoicing isn't about you must meet certain objectives. It's about here's the cookbook. Right, this is what you must do. If you do that, you're compliant. If you don't do all of that, you have a real problem. Well, we'll go to that. So we'll see that we'll look at all of these fields and we analyze that for some 80 countries, and it leads to some very interesting results. You see that Europe is really rather conservative. I mean, it's not that bad compared to, let's say, Russia, for instance. But Europe is, of course, still, if you break out culturally the Commonwealth countries, so people who are basically countries that have been part of the British Empire, regulation generally is much less than that. Asia has a little more, generally speaking, than Europe. And of course, the US, which doesn't have VAT, really almost doesn't, has no rules for e-invoicing, except for the obvious rules about storage of accounting material. I'm going to take you through some of these categories that we look at on electronic invoicing, just to give you a bit of an understanding of the kinds of things you should look at or maybe familiarize yourself with, because you will be hearing more about these, I think, in your daily practice as these things evolve. The first category is obviously integrity and authenticity. Every single country in the world that has legislation specifically around electronic invoicing requires you to be able to prove the integrity and authenticity of your invoices during the entire legal lifetime of your invoice. I think there's one small exception where it is not explicitly set in the law, but for the rest, every country we know of requires that. So, and then, of course, for how long you need to be able to prove that, it runs somewhere between 5 and 10 years, depending on which type of system you're in. If you're in a clearance system, usually the average storage period is 5 years, but you still need to store the evidence of your transaction. You still need to store the electronic invoice as well. And there are different flavors of clearance transactions that I won't go into too much detail, but Brazil and Russia, we might call them clearance countries because they have more or less the same philosophy, but on a detailed level, they are pretty much entirely different. There's very little they have in common except for a few things. For instance, archiving. As I said, everybody needs to archive. You need to archive pretty much in every country that has VAT legislation. These are the three main categories: integrity, authenticity, clearance, if the law prescribes that, and then archiving for a certain period of time. There's a few others. In many of the clearance countries, but also in some other countries, you need to create your electronic invoice in a form and format prescribed in detail, technical form described in detail by the tax administration. So they haven't, obviously, in most cases, looked at existing standards or anything. They've just sat down with people, technical experts from the tax administration, and defined what they believe is the right format and content from a technical perspective of a structured invoice. If you look at Brazil, that may be up to 450 fields. So these are quite significant invoices. There's still, of course, quite a few countries as well, but perhaps not as many as you think, where electronic signatures are actually a hard requirement. In certain cases, there is also a requirement for timestamping. Most of the clearance countries, though, do require you to use electronic signatures on top of this mandatory XML schema that you need to use. And then, of course, combined with clearance, we also see a strong trend in the world of e-invoicing being mandated. So a lot of these countries, the ones that were in orange in my first slide, a lot of those countries have gone in just a few years from basically prohibiting electronic invoicing to discovering that electronic invoicing is actually quite an interesting way for them to enhance controls, and then deciding that they would impose electronic invoicing. So there are countries that literally in 3 or 4 years have gone from you can't do it to you must do it, with the results that we all know of. I don't think we need to go into too many examples, but for those who have tried to meet the Turkey's rules, for instance, earlier this year, you have to come to the conclusion that some of these systems, the maturity of these clearance systems as run by government authorities is not always the way it should be, and that can create quite a few problems. So they mandate it, but it doesn't necessarily always mean it actually works, unfortunately. Then there's another set of rules that you should probably think of, and that is localization. It's unfortunately also a strong trend around the world that the governments will impose you to either work with the local service provider, that must be locally established or registered, or archive your invoices on local soil. It's a little crazy in the world of electronic invoicing, of course, because you probably have copies stored in servers around the world and you don't even know about that. But you must also store a copy in country. Okay, so that's the sort of high-level overview. I'm going to take you through a short journey on the ex-post system, so Europe and some of the other old world countries practice as e-invoicing controls. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the clearance countries to end this presentation. The thing with the ex-post systems is that most of them don't have prescriptive rules. They don't tell you must do A, B, and C. Most of them say you must achieve this result. As I think, and I've had discussions with a number of you here about how difficult it can be if you're in VAT to try and explain to technical people what that means, because technical people who have to implement electronic invoicing usually think in a very binary fashion. Tell me what I have to do, give me the spec. If it's in the spec, let's implement it. If not, let's not do it. But to tell them that, oh, we must be able to guarantee integrity and authenticity for a period of 10 years, but we're free how to do it, people will look at you like, yeah, what can I do with this? But the essence of what you need to do in these non-clearance countries, in some of these ex-post countries, it can be sort of exemplified with this story here. It's a journey of an invoice legally issued in Luxembourg, right, under a VAT number in Luxembourg. It's technically issued on a platform in the US. It's legally received under a VAT number in South Africa, but it's actually technically received and validated in a shared service center in Romania, and then it's stored physically in Spain. Sometimes when I show this, people go like, yeah, you're exaggerating a bit. Actually, this is our daily practice, probably the daily practice of quite a few of you here as well. This is how large multinational corporations work nowadays. Right? That's a pretty interesting journey, and this might happen in a few seconds, if not microseconds, right? This processing of, and so there's a lot of legal implications already to what just happened here. If you walk into a company as a poor tax inspector, in some region in the Netherlands or in northern Italy or whatever, you knock on the door, you just barely know what this company does, and you need to, within a reasonable time, determine that this company in the last 10 years ago actually created that invoice or received it from that supplier with that particular content, so that it was an invoice with integrity and authenticity guaranteed to a reasonable extent. That's a pretty big challenge. Look at it from the perspective of a tax administration. How are you going to do that? Look at what happened in a few microseconds with all the legal implications, and then of course the fact that during that decade or so that passed, the organization that processed the invoice has changed many times, and probably no one who was involved in processing that invoice is still in the same place. The processes have changed completely as well, probably many times in that company. So there's no one around who can tell you what the process was at that point. The systems, of course, have changed many times as well. A decade is a long, long time in IT nowadays. So you're not, that company is not using the same systems anymore, almost for sure. And then, of course, the law has changed several times as well. So this poor tax auditor here has a big puzzle to solve. And the thing that a lot of people we talk to don't really get is that it's a problem for him, but it's actually even more of a problem for the business, because he has the right to basically be in your building together with his colleagues for as long as he desires, and basically turn your administration upside down until they're satisfied that they've found the answers to the questions they're asking themselves. That is very costly, right? And if they don't find the evidence, they might go to your trading partner, which is costly not just in euro or dollar terms. It actually has a reputational risk associated with it as well. And then, of course, if the situation is still unclear, you might get into situations where all of a sudden you have to pay back VAT over the last couple of years or so, which with an average of a VAT rate of more than 20%, really not something you want to have to experience or tell your CFO about. So so there's a mutual interest between tax administrations and businesses to make audits quick and painless. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the business community, particularly, again, technical people, business process people who don't really know about VAT as much as they should, don't necessarily see the cost of that. The cost of that very often is hidden, but it's a very big challenge for tax administrations to try and go through this discovery in a reasonable amount of time, not inflicting too much pain on companies. So if you're in an ex-post country, like the European Union being the most developed regulatory system or region when it comes to ex-post type regulation, what is it that you should really do? If you really go back to basics, this is a very interesting slide because it looks so stupid, Right? An invoice is basically technically defined by its content, so there's a number of things that must be in an invoice. You must guarantee the integrity and authenticity of that invoice from the moment it was issued until the last moment of the mandatory storage period. How do you do that? Obviously, in addition to storing the invoice, again, which is defined by its content, you need to store something else that proves the integrity and authenticity of that invoice. What that something else is depends on how much freedom you have in the jurisdiction you're talking about. But you're always going to store the invoice with something else that proves its integrity and authenticity. An invoice cannot prove itself. I know that sounds really stupid, but for a lot of people, this is a challenge to understand. Like, well, I stored the invoice. Yeah, sure, but I mean, you have to prove that that invoice is real and unchanged, so how are you going to do that? Well, it's in the invoice. It doesn't work that way. Tax administration is going to want to look at something that proves the integrity and authenticity of that invoice. If you look at the European Union, the debate about how that works or should work, the rules around proving integrity and authenticity have evolved at two significant moments. The first was the first directive in 2001, entered into force in 2004. Many of you are familiar with. We've been living under that regime for quite some time, where basically the requirements in terms of what you have to achieve were laid down, and they were not changed under the 2010 directive. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. A lot of people say, yeah, but now there's no requirements anymore. That comes from the fact that e-invoicing is such a multidisciplinary thing, and that, again, when you give those technicians, they think the spec has changed. Because previously the spec said you must produce some kind of whatnot signature, then they did that. Now the spec says you must achieve this result, that you're free to determine how you do it. And then they go, okay, we don't need to produce a signature anymore. Because that's the binary kind of thinking you get into. So it's very tricky with technical people, in multidisciplinary teams, to explain this story. The directive from 2001 and the directive from 2010, the one that entered into force at the beginning of last year, have not changed in terms of base requirements. They're identical. You still need to do exactly the same thing. You still need to prove the integrity and authenticity of the invoice. You still need to get the buyer's consent. You still need to archive the invoice. Exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is how you can do that. The 2001 directive listed a number of methods that member states could choose from, made this very stupid error of telling member states more or less that it was a Chinese menu. They could pick the methods they liked and leave others aside. The 2010 directive kind of fixed that and said, you don't have a choice. You have to accept everything that's in this directive as long as it guarantees the integrity and authenticity. So the thing that has changed between 2001 and 2010 is here. The methods by which you can prove integrity and authenticity are broader. Essentially, it has introduced freedom of evidence. As an enterprise, as a taxable person, if you have conclusive evidence of integrity and authenticity of your invoices, it doesn't matter what form it's in, the tax administration then has to accept that. Mind you, the tax auditor is the one who decides whether or not it's acceptable evidence, right? But you're free to present that evidence in any which form. Now, that's important. But there are still methods that I mentioned in the directive as well, and that's significant for most companies. Because, of course, you're looking for legal certainty is a very, very important thing, particularly in e-invoicing. E-invoicing is always an investment. It's an investment in technology, but more so in procedure and people. Actually changes quite a few things in what you do as an enterprise. So it goes to the heart of some of your most important routines. If you make that investment, you want to make sure that it's actually going to be accepted by the tax administrations that will want to audit your invoices. So the methods that I mentioned in the directive are still important from that perspective. There's still the method for electronic invoicing that I will talk more about that is called qualified electronic signatures. Advanced electronic signatures, which were possible in the previous directive, are no longer given legal status as a specific method in the new directive, in the current directive. EDI, I'll get to what that means, is actually still accepted the way it was under the previous directive. It has the same status, right? But you can also now, and this is the big new thing, there is a new method that has been introduced in 2010, which is all based on using a reliable business controls-based audit trail to prove the integrity and authenticity of your electronic invoices. That's the biggest change between 2001 and 2010. The other big change is previously not all member states had to accept other means. So there was no obligation for member states to have freedom of evidence. Now that obligation exists. So no member state can reject an electronic invoice just because it isn't in a certain form or it doesn't meet certain technical criteria. They must accept it. They must accept your evidence. That doesn't mean that they need to necessarily be convinced by it, but they cannot reject it just because it is not in a certain form. That's what has happened. So again, the important takeaway from this slide is, of course, the upper part here. Right? No one lowered the bar between 2001 and 2010. Whatever people tell you, it's very dangerous to consider that the requirements have actually changed. The only thing that has changed is the number of methods you can apply to meet these base unchanged requirements. Okay, so then if you look at, again, the invoice defined by its content, the content of the invoice, the mandatory content of the invoice, you must prove the integrity and authenticity of. So how do you do that? The first method then that the directive says in Europe is that you can use business control based audit trails. Basically what this is about, and again there's a lot of misunderstandings about this too, I'll try to define it in an understandable way. This is about proving semantically, so on the basis of information in different documents, different data that you have exchanged during your business process, during the transaction, that you need to keep, that prove semantically on the basis of that audit trail information that all of the mandatory elements of your invoice are real and unchanged. Which means that every one of your mandatory components or fields in your invoice must be corroborated by another document that you have stored and that you can prove is reliable from your business process 4, 5, 6, 10 years ago. Right? So this is a very specific method. It's not, as some people say, oh, I've got a purchase order, so I can sort of prove this is a real transaction. It's got nothing to do with that. Read the law, talk to tax administrations, be very careful if people say, if you have a purchase order, it's probably okay. What this is about is proving the integrity and authenticity of your invoices on the basis of an audit trail that semantically proves, makes it obvious to a tax administration that all of the mandatory fields in your invoice are real and unchanged. That's what the law says. There is not a single person, there's not a single expert that will contradict that. Right? That is what is required from you if a tax administration really asks for it. What does that mean in practice? Again, I could spend days talking about this because we've been involved in a lot of the writing of standards, and if you wish, we can give you some references of good guidance documentation that actually exists, even though a lot of people don't know about it. But essentially, on the highest level, what it means is you're going to probably you're going to create an audit trail, you and your trading partner, if you want to use this method, have to create an audit trail that essentially consists of 3 types of information. It's information you create yourself. That, of course, has the lowest evidence status. Right? It's sort of like, trust me, I know what I'm doing. I made this myself. It proves my invoice kind of thing. But there are ways of making internally created information credible. For instance, separation of duties, internal audit reports of your processes, etc., can actually make that information quite credible as well. The other thing you're going to store as part of your audit trail is information created by your trading partner, purchase orders, other types of documents that you might have received or exchanged with them. And thirdly, quite importantly, in order to have a good, reliable, complete audit trail, most likely also you need payment information or transport documents coming from a third-party logistics transporter or logistics provider that you've used in the process. If you have that, and there is enough information in these documents to prove that the content of your invoice is real and unchanged, then you can use this method to meet the requirements of Article 233 of the VAT Directive. The other method is to use qualified signatures. I think most of you probably know more or less how signatures work. I cannot spend too much time on this now, but basically it's an automated process in software that you don't see. It computes a unique fingerprint on your invoice data, encrypts that with what is called a private key, and sticks something in the signature that's called a certificate, which identifies a certain legal or natural person. And that those two together can be matched in order to mathematically prove the integrity of the document, and then based on a certain legal scheme with third parties called certification authorities, they can also prove rather conclusively the authenticity of the supplier or the service provider that created the signature. Now, one thing that, for a reason that I cannot understand, I believe to be incredibly important, is really not very well known, is that if you use a qualified electronic signature, this is the only method available. It's actually a really unique thing in e-business law or law altogether. It reverses the burden of proof. So a qualified electronic signature, theoretically at least, turns the table on the tax auditor. You can say, I've got a qualified electronic signature, therefore you must presume the integrity and authenticity of this invoice. And if you think there's a problem with it, you have to disprove it rather than me having to prove it. big evidence benefit, obviously, in a tax audit setting. And again, I don't quite understand why people don't talk more about this, because it truly is unique. I'm a lawyer. I've never seen anything like it. The only thing in the real paper-based world that's comparable with it is a notarized document that has that kind of strength of evidence. You can actually get that with an automated electronic procedure using this technology as well. I'm not going to talk too much about this one, but basically the message of this story is that some people say, electronic signatures are kind of fine. I understand that proves the integrity and authenticity of invoices, but the certificate that these signatures are based on have a limited lifetime, and when they expire, there goes my evidence. I know we've heard that story before. I hear it all the time. It's nonsense. For about a decade now, the industry has been using what we call long-term verifiable signatures that basically build up layers of evidence of the validity of the signing certificate that is used in such a way that it's conclusive proof of the validity of the certificate at the moment of signing. Again, this is built up automatically in software. There's absolutely nothing that a company needs to do in order to get this kind of evidence, but it's an important message here. Don't let people tell you that electronic signatures somehow magically expire and then they become worthless. That's not the case. It hasn't been the case for the last 10 years. Then there's this third method. Remember, we have 3 methods and a fourth, which is basically anything else. The third method is called EDI. EDI is not what you think it is. If you have people in the company who say, this is our EDI process, that doesn't mean that is then a compliant EDI process. This is EDI defined by lawyers and politicians. So it's what they thought EDI was about. Put that in the law, and then that's what you need to do in order to comply. The essence of this method in the European Union is that you use an interchange agreement that was created by the European Commission 20 years ago, and on the basis of what they thought was a proper interchange agreement. And you need to maintain that with your trading partners. Document in that agreement how the two parties are maintaining integrity and authenticity over the lifetime of the invoice, and then prove that you've actually implemented that historically. Then you have compliant EDI. Clearance systems, I think, are in a sense much more exciting because they're new, and it's kind of a sexy story because, as I said, you go from these countries that had nothing a few years ago who have 90% e-invoicing today. And with basically a legislative and a technical approach that's, you might not like it. We Europeans tend to think of it as very big brotherish. You know, there's some tax administration that tells you precisely how to do it all, and there's no deviations from it, and it's very tough, and the tax administrations are actually very tough in enforcing the law as well. But it's fascinating to see how they've done this in such a short time. So how does clearance work? On the highest level, it's basically a supplier and a buyer have a third trading partner. The tax administration have imposed themselves as a third processing partner in the chain. You need to send your invoice to the tax administration before you can even send it to your trading partner in most cases. We'll get to that. And this is usually, as I said, combined with mandates. So you need to actually, not only is this a very prescriptive cookbook of how you need to do electronic invoicing, you also need to do it by a certain time. And in some countries, those mandates are very aggressive. Right? In some countries, they're ridiculously aggressive. They pass the law in April, and you need to be, you need to have electronic invoicing following this cookbook 6 months later. That's very challenging, very, very challenging. And we've seen many, many cases where companies have really spent millions, even for small markets, millions in order to get to a point where they would comply by that particular deadline. There's a couple of things about these countries that makes it even more interesting, at least intellectually. Adoption rates are, of course, fabulous because, well, there's a mandate. It really has proven that it reduces fraud on the business side, but something else we don't talk much about in many of these countries. One of the other tax problems that existed was, of course, corrupt tax control officers, and this system sort of takes away that problem as well. Even more interesting is that in many of these countries, all of a sudden, the governments that had very poor economic statistics previously now have line-level, real-time data of every single transaction that goes through their economy. Now, just think about that for a second. Overnight, Brazil could see on a line level every single invoice what happens in their economy. This is, of course, this is such a treasure that many of these countries have only just started to realize what they can do with it. And there are parliamentary debates, for instance, some of you might be aware, for instance, there was one in Mexico about certain government services really wanting to have access to that data. Of course, there's lots of people who would like to mine and explore that data for other purposes than just tax. There's a couple of other things about these. What we also see in these clearance countries is that it has created a local base of trust. The government basically signs off on invoices even before they're issued. So for trade finance, that's a very interesting scheme, of course, because financial institutions who want to provide credit to either the supplier or the buyer or both have basically collateral, the best you can think of. The best security you can think of is, of course, a government saying this is kosher. So we see a lot of these countries actually have vibrant trade finance sector. And of course, there are other value-added services that are coming up. I don't need to tell you guys that in these clearance countries, compliance is a black or white proposition. You can't sort of be, in Europe, you can actually be half pregnant. You can sort of comply and get away with it in some cases. Here, that doesn't work. In these clearance countries, typically, it's a matter of bits and bytes. You've got to have them all, or you will basically be considered a fraudster. Not producing a compliant invoice in many of these laws is equated with tax evasion. So it's pretty tough. I mean, there's no excuses. How does clearance work? On the highest level, again, I've talked about this. Just again, the supplier sends invoice data, usually in a specific XML format, signed with a key. The certificate have been issued usually by the tax administration or by an accredited certification authority. Sign that, send it to either the tax administration's own clearance service or to a third party that acts on its behalf. In Turkey, in Mexico, in Russia, it's a third party. It's a private enterprise that has been accredited by the tax administration to do this clearance process. In other countries, like Brazil and a few others, it's actually the tax administration system itself. Then that agent or the state system sends an okay back to the supplier, says, okay, you can issue this now. The supplier issues it to the buyer. The buyer then generally has to go back to the tax administration system or private accredited party and say, is this actually a compliant invoice? Gets a message back and the circle is round. That all sounds kind of, there's a lot of extra processes, but at least it's understandable. The problem is, of course, that many of these countries, as I said earlier, do have their own interpretation. The cookbooks are quite different, so there's a whole bunch of other types of services and features that have been introduced over the last couple of years. A good number of countries are implementing acknowledgement and rejection messages in this system to make the circle even rounder, make sure that the tax administration actually has evidence that the buyer has accepted the supply. That's really good evidence. But there are also things that have to do with contingency. With some of these countries, when they introduced clearance systems first, they didn't think of the fact that sometimes the internet wasn't working so well in their country, or electricity wasn't working so well in their country. And because they actually created a dependency with the logistics process, in other words, you couldn't, if it was a goods transport or sales of goods, you couldn't actually start your dispatch until the invoice was cleared by the government. But if the internet is down, you've got a problem. So, in the case of perishables, standing in a truck waiting for an invoice to be issued when the internet is down, that leads to some very, very nasty situations, and lots of jokes and anecdotes about what happened next. But many chickens have died, apparently, in Brazil before people came up with this contingency-type procedure, sitting in a truck waiting for the invoice to be issued. There are cancellation messages that many have implemented. And then, of course, there's some scary things that go on in, for instance, Russia and now also Mexico. So the tax administration is saying, hey, you know what, if you do this clearance with invoices, we would like you to do it with a few other accounting documents as well. So in Russia, there's a couple of mandatory messages, what they call primary accounting documents, that must be processed through the same clearance system. And many of you are probably aware that Mexico a few months ago introduced a mandatory rule for salary slips to go through the same system as well. So all salary information in Mexico must be cleared by what's called a PAC, acting on behalf of the Mexican tax administration before it is considered a valid salary slip. The entire economy basically works that way. Finally, one other innovation in Turkey is that, which is a really interesting one in our world, because we work a lot with service providers whose job it is to then deliver the invoice to the buyer. In Turkey, it's actually the tax administration that delivers the invoice to the buyer. Another crazy innovation, which creates lots of challenges for people who need to implement this in IT. That was my overview of what's happening in the world, a little bit of an insight in the different systems.
Okay, good. Christian, thank you very much indeed.